Hey guys, tonight we're going to journey back to an era of emperors and empires, to a time when Rome, the mighty center of the known world, found itself grappling with a problem it never expected. A ruler who had a rather peculiar relationship with joy. Imagine, if you will, the bustling forum, usually alive with the clamor of merchants, the impassioned speeches of senators, and the general hubbub of a million souls living, thriving, and yes, laughing. Now, picture a hush falling over it, a strange, enforced quietude where genuine mirth was not just discouraged, but actively frowned upon. You might think you could sneak a giggle, a suppressed snort, but trust me, in this Rome, you probably wouldn't survive a day. The very air around you would feel heavy with unspoken jests, a palpable tension of contained amusement. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling up to it, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins not in Rome, but in the sun-drenched city of Emesa, in what is now modern-day Syria. It's the early 3rd century CE, and the Roman Empire is, shall we say, a bit unstable. Emperors are popping up and disappearing faster than you can say, "Hail Caesar." And into this turbulent scene steps a young man, a teenager actually, named Varius Avitus Bassianus. He's about 14 years old, a priest of the local sun god, Elagabal. This deity, often depicted as a black conical stone, is quite popular in Emesa, and our young Varius is dedicated, utterly devoted to its worship. Now, this isn't just any teenager. He's connected to the imperial Severan dynasty through his formidable grandmother, Julia Maesa. She's a savvy political operator, and she sees an opportunity in her grandson. The current emperor, Macrinus, isn't exactly beloved, and a power vacuum is just waiting to be filled. So, Mesa, with the help of her daughter, Julia Soemias, Varius's mother, begins to spread a rumor, a rather ambitious rumor, claiming that Varius is actually the illegitimate son of the recently deceased and much more popular Emperor Caracalla. It's a bold move, a historical "who's your daddy" moment, designed to drum up support, and it works. The Legio III Gallica, stationed nearby, are big fans of Caracalla, and they're tired of Macrinus. They're persuaded by Mesa's cunning, and in May of 218 CE, they proclaim young Varius Avitus Bassianus as emperor. He promptly renames himself Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, but he's gone down in history by the name of his god, Elagabalus. A mainstream historical fact for you right there. Elagabalus became emperor at the tender age of 14, largely due to the political maneuvering of his grandmother and mother. Now, here's a quirky tidbit. The Legio III Gallica was so fervent in their support that they apparently marched into battle with a standard depicting the black stone of Elagabal rather than the traditional Roman eagle. Imagine that, legions of stern Roman soldiers usually so stoic, following a giant rock on a pole. You can almost hear the whispered jokes among the ranks. Even then, it's a detail that hints at the strange, almost theatrical nature of this young emperor's ascension. As for scholarly debate, historians still argue whether Elagabalus was truly a religious fanatic, a naive teenager manipulated by his female relatives, or a deliberate provocateur trying to shatter Roman traditions from within. Was his devotion to Elagabal genuine, or was it a convenient political tool? The truth is, we'll probably never know for sure, wrapped as it is in the often biased accounts of ancient historians who lived long after his reign. But what we do know is that his arrival in Rome would shake the very foundations of its staid, traditional society and set the stage for some truly extraordinary and often bizarre imperial decisions. You can almost feel the collective sigh of the Roman elite as they heard the news of this new, unconventional ruler approaching their venerable city. The news of young Elagabalus's ascension and his impending arrival must have rippled through Rome like an uncomfortable tremor. Imagine the senators, stiff in their togas, gathered in hushed corners of the forum, their brows furrowed. They were accustomed to emperors who, while sometimes cruel or capricious, at least played by the established rules of Roman governance and religion. This new emperor, a Syrian teenager dedicated to a foreign sun god, was an unknown quantity, and the whispers would have been rife with apprehension. You can practically hear the collective, polite coughs as they tried to make sense of it all. When he finally arrived in Rome in 219 CE, the initial impressions were memorable, to say the least. Elagabalus didn't just walk into the city, he made an entrance. He brought with him the sacred black stone of Elagabal, a meteorite, which he paraded through the streets on a chariot, not drawn by horses, but by white oxen, adorned with gold and jewels. He himself walked backward in front of it, guiding the oxen, facing his god. Now, if you're a traditional Roman, used to seeing the venerable images of Jupiter or Mars carried in procession, this was quite a sight. It was less a triumphal march and more a surreal, slow motion parade from a dream. And just to add another layer of oddity, he insisted that the most prominent Roman deities, including the venerable Jupiter Capitolinus, be moved to the new temple he was building for Elagabal on the Palatine Hill. This was, to put it mildly, deeply offensive to Roman religious sensibilities. It was like trying to replace the Vatican with a shrine to an obscure rock. This wasn't just a quirky, personal preference. It was a profound cultural clash. Roman religion was deeply intertwined with the state, and its traditions were ancient and revered. Elagabalus, by elevating his foreign god above all others, was essentially upending the entire spiritual foundation of Rome. This is a mainstream historical fact. Elagabalus attempted to force the worship of his god, Elagabal, upon the Roman populace, a move that alienated the traditional Roman religious establishment. A rather quirky tidbit related to his arrival. Elagabalus reportedly sent a painted portrait of himself to Rome before his arrival, depicting him in his priestly robes of Elagabal, wearing a tiara and robes of silk and gold. This was highly unconventional for a Roman emperor who usually presented themselves in military garb or traditional senatorial togas. It was his way of saying, get used to it, this is the new normal, before anyone even had a chance to object. Imagine getting a heads up email from your new eccentric boss with a picture attached that makes you scratch your head. That was Elagabalus's early warning. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus genuinely believed he was divinely appointed to reform Roman religion, or if his actions were merely the impulsive whims of a spoiled, powerful teenager. Was he a true religious reformer, a sort of ancient prophet, or just a chaotic agent of change? Simply because he could be, the question remains open, and the sources, mostly written by his detractors, paint a picture of a madman. But perhaps he saw himself as a visionary, bringing a new, purer form of worship to a jaded empire. We'll probably never know his true motivations, shrouded as they are in the mists of 1800 years of interpretation. But what is clear is that Rome, accustomed to the stern, practical nature of its leaders, was about to experience a reign unlike any other, one where the sacred and the absurd often danced a very awkward tango. You can almost feel the collective intake of breath from the Roman citizens as they watched this strange new emperor usher in an era of unprecedented peculiarity. Once settled in the opulent imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, Elagabalus's daily life became a masterclass in opulent unconventionality. You'd wake each morning not to the predictable rhythms of a Roman noble, but to a palace operating on its own bizarre logic. He loved to dress up, not in military uniform or a simple toga, but in flowing silken robes, often dyed purple or gold, adorned with jewels. He wore makeup, plucked his body hair, and apparently found great joy in appearing as feminine as possible, much to the horror of conservative Romans. Imagine the murmurs in the halls as the austere guards watched their emperor sashay by in outfits more suited to a goddess than a general. It was a clear signal. This was not business as usual. His days were a kaleidoscope of sensory overload. He reportedly scented the palace fountains with wine, a delightful waste of good vino, and enjoyed bathing in lavish settings with fragrant oils and rare perfumes. When he dined, which we'll get to in more detail shortly, it was always a spectacle. But it wasn't just about personal indulgence. Elagabalus also enjoyed surrounding himself with what the Roman historians called effeminate men and charioteers, elevating them to positions of power and influence. This was another mainstream historical fact. Elagabalus's court was known for its extravagance and for promoting individuals based on personal favoritism rather than traditional Roman virtues or experience. And for a truly quirky tidbit, Elagabalus was said to have ordered the construction of a giant, retractable canopy over the Colosseum made of silk, which would release perfumed water onto the spectators during gladiatorial games. Imagine sitting there, watching a fight to the death, and suddenly you're getting a gentle, rose-scented mist sprayed on you from above. It sounds delightful, or perhaps just incredibly distracting, depending on your preferred gladiatorial viewing experience. It certainly wasn't about enhancing the blood and thunder. It was about adding an unexpected, luxurious flourish to the spectacle. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus's rejection of traditional Roman masculinity and his embrace of effeminacy were a genuine expression of his personal identity, perhaps even an early form of gender nonconformity, or if they were deliberate acts of provocation designed to undermine the established order. Was he simply a young man exploring himself under the immense pressure of power, or was he intentionally dismantling Roman societal norms piece by piece? The ancient sources, being products of their time, tend to condemn his behavior as depraved and un-Roman, but modern interpretations offer a more nuanced view. Regardless of his intent, his daily life in the palace was a constant, living performance, a flamboyant challenge to everything Rome held sacred. You can almost feel the collective clenching of jaws among the more traditional senators as they navigated the perfumed, unconventional world of Elagabalus's court. When it came to dining, Elagabalus's peculiar tastes weren't just about what he ate, but how he ate it. You might envision lavish Roman banquets, overflowing with rich foods and fine wines. And while Elagabalus certainly had the lavish part down, his approach to gastronomy was more performance art than sustenance. He was known for serving exotic and often bizarre dishes that would make even the most adventurous modern foodie raise an eyebrow. Think camel heels, flamingo tongues, or peacock brains. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm perfectly happy with a nice lasagna. Thank you very much. He would stage banquets where the food itself was less important than the presentation and the sheer absurdity. One particularly quirky tidbit: he was said to have served dishes made entirely of glass or stone, purely for the visual effect, knowing full well his guests couldn't actually eat them. Imagine trying to politely gnaw on a marble peach while maintaining your composure. He also enjoyed arranging meals by color, so you might find yourself confronted with an entirely green course, or perhaps a completely purple one. It sounds like a child's birthday party, if that child had unlimited imperial funds and a penchant for the truly outlandish. But it wasn't just about the weird ingredients. Elagabalus also enjoyed scattering vast quantities of gold and silver, coins, or even valuable pearls among his guests at feasts, often throwing them from high up in the palace. While this sounds like a great way to get rich quick, imagine the chaos, the scrambling, the inevitable elbows to the face, all while you're trying to enjoy your flamingo tongue. It was a chaotic generosity, less about hospitality and more about demonstrating overwhelming, almost dizzying wealth. This is a mainstream historical fact. Elagabalus was infamous for his incredibly extravagant and often wasteful banquets, which included serving rare and unusual foods. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus's culinary excesses were simply the result of boundless, youthful indulgence, or if they were a deliberate, calculated assault on the traditional Roman virtues of moderation and frugality. Was he just a pampered brat who loved to shock? Or was he actively trying to redefine what it meant to be an emperor, using the dinner table as his stage? Some scholars suggest his bizarre banquets were a form of performance art, a way to exert his absolute power by forcing his aristocratic guests to endure increasingly absurd situations. Regardless, you can almost hear the collective groans of his dinner guests as they wondered what bizarre concoction or strange spectacle awaited them next. It was less a relaxing meal and more an exercise in bewildered endurance amidst all the extravagance and bizarre culinary adventures. Elagabalus decided to make a truly unprecedented move. He decided to ban laughter. Yes, you heard that right. Imagine a world where a spontaneous chuckle, a hearty guffaw, or even a quiet giggle could be seen as an act of defiance against the very empire. This wasn't just about making people somber, it was about controlling an emotion, a fundamental human expression of joy. It's a mainstream historical fact, perhaps one of the most baffling, that Elagabalus, at some point during his reign, issued decrees or made it clear through his behavior that public expressions of mirth were unwelcome. Now, it's important to note that the ancient sources are, as always, a bit dramatic and perhaps not entirely precise on how this ban was enacted. Was it an official edict, carved into stone, posted in the forum for all to see, or was it more of an unspoken understanding, a chilling atmosphere that permeated the capital, where courtiers and citizens alike quickly learned that a light-hearted mood could lead to serious trouble? Historians still argue whether it was a formalized law or a pervasive cultural suppression enforced through fear and example. Regardless, the effect was the same. The very air of Rome grew heavy with the weight of unexpressed joy. You would find yourself constantly monitoring your own expressions. A joke from a friend might be met with a silent nod, a forced straight face, or perhaps a nervous glance over the shoulder. The street performers, usually so vibrant, would find their acts muted, their crowds hesitant to react. Imagine a stand up comedian trying to perform in a silent room. It's like a corporate meeting that just never ends. But instead of the usual boredom, there's an undercurrent of dread. The sound of children playing would be hushed, their innocent giggles quickly stifled by watchful parents. It's a uniquely quirky tidbit of history to imagine a city where laughter became a subversive act, a quiet rebellion against an emperor's whim. Why would he do this? Some scholars suggest it was part of his overarching attempt to impose the strict, somber religious practices of his Syrian sun god, Elagabal, on the Romans. The worship of Elagabal was apparently quite serious, lacking the joyous festivals and theatrical displays common in Roman religious rites. Perhaps Elagabalus believed that a solemn, unsmiling populace was more conducive to true spiritual devotion. Or perhaps, in his youthful arrogance, he simply found the sounds of unbridled human happiness grating on his imperial nerves. Was it a calculated religious imposition, or simply the petulant dictate of a teenager who disliked being laughed at? The ancient authors, naturally, present it as another sign of his tyrannical madness. But you, living under this strange prohibition, would only feel the stifling quiet, the constant low hum of suppressed amusement threatening to burst free. The very air you breathed felt constrained, like a collective holding of breath. So, how do you enforce a ban on laughter in a city as vibrant and sprawling as ancient Rome? It's not like you can install laugh detectors on every street corner or have a dedicated giggle police force. The methods, as far as we can gather from the surviving accounts, were more insidious, relying on fear and social pressure rather than overt enforcement. You wouldn't see signs plastered everywhere saying, "No laughing." Instead, you'd simply know. The word would spread, perhaps through a chilling example set at court or a quiet whisper from a guard. Imagine a senator's forced smile hardening into a grimace, or a courtier's barely suppressed snicker dying on their lips as the emperor's gaze, or perhaps the gaze of one of his favorites, drifted their way. The most effective way to enforce such a bizarre decree wasn't through specific punishments for a chuckle, but by creating an atmosphere where expressing joy became a risk, a quirky tidbit. Some sources suggest that anyone caught laughing too heartily might find themselves invited to one of Elagabalus's banquets, which, as we remember, could be its own form of peculiar punishment. Imagine being forced to try and eat glass fruit or endure a shower of pearls while maintaining a stoic face. The empire had plenty of eyes and ears. Informers were a constant presence in Roman society, and under an emperor like Elagabalus, the incentive to report even minor transgressions, like an inappropriate chuckle, would have been high. Your neighbors, your slaves, even your distant relatives might be listening. This creates a chilling silence, a palpable tension where everyone is constantly self-policing their own expressions. You'd quickly learn to develop a neutral, almost blank expression, mastering the art of the polite non-smile. It's a mainstream historical fact that tyrannical rulers often relied on networks of informers to control public behavior, and Elagabalus, though perhaps more eccentric than purely tyrannical, certainly fostered an environment where caution was paramount. Historians still argue whether the ban on laughter was literally interpreted as a legal prohibition, or if it was more a hyperbolic description by hostile ancient writers to convey the emperor's general disdain for traditional Roman leisure and joy. Was it a formal decree, or was it a social taboo enforced by the fear of imperial displeasure and the emperor's unpredictable nature? Regardless, the effect on daily life for you, the Roman citizen, would be undeniable. The lively banter in the taverns would soften, the boisterous jokes of the bathhouses would subside, and even the street vendors might call out their wares in a slightly more subdued tone. The once vibrant hum of Roman life would acquire a nervous, almost mournful undertone. It's a strange thing to consider, a society where joy itself becomes a dangerous act, and the simplest, most human of expressions is stifled by an emperor's whim. You'd find yourself suppressing that tickle in your throat, just in case. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, true human nature, like water, always finds a way to flow around obstacles. The ban on laughter, no matter how rigorously enforced, couldn't completely eradicate humor. Instead, it simply pushed it underground, transforming open merriment into a secret, conspiratorial delight. You'd witness it in the subtle glances between friends, a shared flicker of amusement that needed no sound. A mainstream historical fact here. Throughout history, oppressive regimes have often found that while they can suppress outward expressions, they rarely extinguish the human spirit's need for connection and defiance. Imagine a private dinner party away from the prying eyes of informers and the emperor's agents. A witty remark might be met not with boisterous laughter, but with a series of silent, shoulders shaking tremors. Perhaps someone would cover their mouth, their eyes crinkling in mirth, a silent acknowledgement of the humor. It's like a secret handshake for a joke, a silent communion of amusement. You'd develop an acute sensitivity to subtle cues, a raised eyebrow, a twitch of the lip, a barely perceptible nod that signaled shared amusement. It's a truly quirky tidbit to picture Romans engaged in a silent comedy club where the only applause was the quiet shiver of a suppressed laugh. The jokes wouldn't disappear, they'd simply become more nuanced, more layered. Political satire, always a Roman favorite, would evolve into a game of clever allusions and double meanings, understood only by those in the know. You might hear a story about a particularly foolish sheep, and everyone would understand the unstated parallel to a certain emperor. The humor became a shared secret, a defiant act of mental freedom. This shared understanding would forge a stronger bond among those who dared to find amusement, creating a quiet network of resistance. Historians still argue whether the quiet defiance of laughter was a significant factor in Elagabalus's eventual downfall, or if it was merely a symptom of the broader discontent simmering beneath the surface. Was the inability to laugh openly just another brick in the wall of popular resentment, or a minor irritant compared to his religious reforms and bizarre behaviors? Regardless, for you, living through it, that shared silent chuckle, that moment of eye contact with a fellow conspirator in humor would have been a vital spark of defiance. It was a reminder that even emperors couldn't control everything, and that the human need for joy, however suppressed, would always find a way to breathe. You'd find a strange, quiet satisfaction in those unvoiced giggles, a small victory against the looming shadow of imperial solemnity. Elagabalus's unconventionality wasn't limited to his public persona or his peculiar decrees. It extended intimately into his private life, particularly his choices for partners. You might expect a Roman emperor to marry into a powerful senatorial family, forging alliances and ensuring dynastic stability. Elagabalus, however, seemed determined to defy every expectation. He reportedly married and divorced several women, sometimes with astonishing speed, and his choices for imperial consorts often sent shockwaves through the conservative Roman elite. Mainstream historical fact: Elagabalus married Aquilia Severa, a Vestal virgin, a priestess who had taken a sacred vow of chastity. This act was considered a profound sacrilege, as Vestal virgins were highly revered figures whose purity was seen as essential for the well-being of Rome. Breaking their vows carried the penalty of being buried alive. His justification? He claimed the marriage would produce godlike children, a bizarre theological twist to an utterly scandalous act. Imagine the gasps in the Roman salons, the hushed condemnation among the priestly colleges. It was an affront to their deepest religious and social norms. But his relationships weren't just with women. The ancient sources, often hostile and sensationalist, also describe Elagabalus's relationships with men. He reportedly had a number of male lovers, one of whom, a charioteer named Heracles, he elevated to an unprecedented position of power. even declaring him husband and having others call him empress. This is a truly quirky tidbit that further highlights his profound disregard for Roman societal norms regarding gender and sexuality. Such open displays of same sex relationships, especially from an emperor, were highly unusual and deeply unsettling to the Roman aristocracy, who valued traditional marital structures and male dominance. It was a scandal wrapped in a spectacle, designed, perhaps, to shock and awe. Historians still argue whether these relationships were genuine expressions of his sexuality, a deliberate defiance of Roman norms, or a political tool to further alienate the traditional establishment. Was he truly bisexual or homosexual, living authentically in an era that largely condemned such open displays? Or was he merely using his personal life as another means to dismantle Roman traditions and assert his absolute unfettered power? The sources, written by those who despised him, are often eager to portray him as depraved and morally corrupt, making it difficult to discern his true motivations. Regardless of the intent, his intimate choices created an uproar, adding another layer of controversy to his already chaotic reign. You, as a contemporary Roman, would have found yourself navigating not just political intrigue, but a dizzying array of social and sexual scandals emanating directly from the imperial palace. The gossip columns of Rome would have been working overtime, if they existed, in an age deeply superstitious and reliant on divine favor. Elagabalus's increasingly bizarre actions and disregard for tradition inevitably led Romans to seek meaning, or perhaps just solace, in omens and divine interpretations. You'd find yourself looking for signs in everything: a strange flight of birds, an unusual astronomical event, or even the peculiar behavior of animals. When an emperor defies the gods so openly, the common belief was that the gods would surely respond, and often not in a pleasant way. This is a mainstream historical fact. Ancient Romans placed enormous significance on omens, dreams, and prophecies, believing they revealed the will of the gods, and often portended future events, especially regarding the state. A truly quirky tidbit related to this: it was said that Elagabalus, in his zeal to understand and perhaps even control the divine, engaged in various forms of divination, some of which were considered highly unorthodox and even abhorrent by Roman standards. He reportedly consulted astrologers and soothsayers constantly, often at the expense of traditional Roman religious practices. There were even rumors, spread by his detractors, of human sacrifices being performed as part of his rituals to Elagabal. While these claims are likely exaggerated or fabricated to blacken his name, they highlight the fear and disgust his religious zealotry instilled in the Roman populace. Imagine hearing whispers of such dark rituals while trying to interpret a bird's flight to predict the next harvest. The more unsettling his reign became, the more you'd hear hushed conversations about divine displeasure. Was the recent bad harvest a sign? Did that earthquake mean the gods were truly angry about the Vestal Virgin marriage? Every unusual event, every misfortune, was filtered through the lens of Elagabalus's reign and his perceived offenses against the ancient Roman deities. This constant search for omens created an atmosphere of anxiety, where everyday occurrences took on a sinister significance. It's like living in a constant state of impending doom, where every creak of the floorboards could be a message from the heavens, or perhaps just a draft. Historians still argue whether the widespread belief in negative omens during Elagabalus's reign was a genuine reflection of supernatural portents, or if it was a retrospective narrative constructed by later historians to rationalize his eventual downfall. Was it truly the gods expressing their anger, or was it merely the Roman people projecting their anxieties and discontent onto the divine? Regardless, for you, a Roman citizen, these interpretations would have provided a framework, however unsettling, to understand the chaotic world unfolding around you. They offered a sense of agency, a way to connect the incomprehensible actions of your emperor to a larger, divine plan, even if that plan seemed to involve a lot of divine frowning. You'd find yourself scanning the skies, looking for any sign, good or ill, that might hint at what was coming next. The worship of Elagabalus's sun god, Elagabal, was at the very core of his identity and his reign. You see, the Roman Empire, for all its vastness, was accustomed to absorbing new gods into its pantheon, or at least giving them a respectable, subordinate position. But Elagabalus had a different idea entirely. He wasn't interested in integration. He was interested in domination. His grand plan was to make Elagabal the supreme deity of Rome, a concept utterly foreign and deeply offensive to the traditional Roman religious establishment. This is a mainstream historical fact. Elagabalus attempted to elevate the Syrian sun god, Elagabal, to the position of the chief deity in the Roman pantheon, an unprecedented religious imposition. He built a magnificent new temple for Elagabal on the Palatine Hill, right in the heart of Rome, near the imperial palace. This was not just any temple, it was intended to be the central shrine of the entire Roman world, overshadowing even the ancient temple of Jupiter Capitolinus. To further solidify his god's supremacy, Elagabalus reportedly had sacred relics from other Roman cults: the Vestal Virgin's fire, the Palladium, a sacred statue of Pallas Athena from Troy, and even the Magna Mater, Great Mother stone, brought to his new temple and placed alongside the black stone of Elagabal. Imagine the scandal, the quiet horror, as these revered symbols of Roman identity were treated as mere accessories to a foreign god. It was like taking the crown jewels and putting them in a local church museum, a truly quirky tidbit that demonstrates his religious fervor. Elagabalus would personally lead the ceremonies for his god, often dancing around the black stone to the sounds of cymbals and drums. Clad in his elaborate Syrian priestly robes, this was a stark contrast to the dignified, often stoic, public rituals of traditional Roman priests. You can almost see the Roman senators, stiff in their togas, watching this spectacle with a mixture of bewilderment and profound disapproval. It was less a solemn religious ceremony and more a psychedelic rock concert from a different dimension. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus's religious zeal was born of genuine, fervent belief, or if it was a calculated political strategy to consolidate power and establish a new, more autocratic form of imperial rule, perhaps inspired by Eastern monarchies, where the ruler was a divine figure. Was he truly a devout priest king or a cunning manipulator using religion as a tool for political control? The truth is likely somewhere in between, a complex tapestry of youthful fanaticism and imperial ambition. But for you, living in Rome at the time, the site of the Black Stone, the new temple, and the emperor's unusual rituals would have been a constant, unsettling reminder that the very foundations of your society were being rapidly and bizarrely reshaped. You'd find yourself wondering if the sun god truly held sway over your destiny now, amidst his profound religious fervor and strange personal habits. Elagabalus still had to perform the duties of an emperor, which included organizing the public games and spectacles that were so vital to Roman life. You'd think that with all his eccentricity, these events would be something truly remarkable, a chance for him to connect with the populace through shared entertainment. And they were remarkable, just perhaps not in the way Romans were used. 2. This is a mainstream historical fact. Roman emperors understood the importance of providing bread and circuses to keep the populace content, and Elagabalus, despite his oddities, continued this tradition. However, his approach to these spectacles was predictably, delightfully peculiar. Instead of straightforward gladiatorial contests or chariot races, Elagabalus would infuse them with his unique brand of chaotic luxury. For instance, he was said to have released serpents into the crowd at the gladiatorial games, not to harm anyone, but simply to cause a delightful panic. Imagine sitting there, expecting a nice, bloody fight, and suddenly, snake slithers past your feet. It's a truly quirky tidbit that speaks volumes about his sense of humor, or lack thereof, when it came to public entertainment. He wasn't aiming for applause. He was aiming for a reaction, any reaction. He also reportedly replaced the traditional animals in some parades with more exotic and bizarre choices. Instead of lions or elephants, you might see a procession of zebras or even ostriches pulling chariots, all adorned in gold and jewels. It was less about demonstrating imperial might and more about showing off boundless, almost nonsensical wealth. These spectacles, while undeniably grand, often left the Roman populace more bewildered than impressed. They were designed to shock and entertain in a way that defied Roman expectations, a spectacle of absurdity rather than power. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus's lavish and unusual games were a deliberate attempt to break down traditional Roman societal structures and introduce a more oriental style of imperial rule, or simply the impulsive whims of a young man with unlimited resources and a desire for novelty. Was he trying to transform Roman culture, or was he just having a very expensive, very public laugh at its expense? Regardless, for you, sitting in the stands, these games would have been a strange mix of awe and discomfort. You'd find yourself shifting uneasily in your seat, wondering if the next chariot would be pulled by flamingos or if the emperor would decide to shower the crowd with live fish instead of flowers. The unpredictability was the only predictable element, and it kept everyone on edge. While Elagabalus was busy alienating the Roman elite with his bizarre rituals, peculiar banquets, and anti laughter policies, the people who truly held the ultimate power in Rome, the Praetorian Guard, were growing increasingly restless. You see, the Praetorians were the emperor's personal bodyguard, the elite soldiers stationed in Rome, and their loyalty was crucial. They had the power to make or break an emperor, and many a Roman ruler had met their end at the hands of their own disgruntled guards. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Praetorian Guard played a king-making and breaking role in Roman politics throughout the imperial period. Initially, they had supported Elagabalus, swayed by his grandmother's propaganda and their dislike for the previous emperor. But as his reign progressed, their patience began to wear thin. Imagine being a tough, battle-hardened soldier, used to stern, military-minded emperors, and suddenly, your commander-in-chief is parading around in silk dresses, declaring himself a god and demanding that everyone stop laughing. It's safe to say, morale wasn't at an all-time high. The Praetorians, who were largely traditional Romans, would have found his behavior deeply insulting to their Roman virtues and their sense of martial honor, a truly quirky tidbit about their growing discontent. It's said that Elagabalus, in his attempts to win over the soldiers, would sometimes distribute large sums of money or even exotic animals directly to them, sometimes by simply throwing it into their barracks. While this might sound appealing at first, it often felt undignified to the soldiers who preferred traditional military discipline and respect to these chaotic, almost childish displays of generosity. It was less a strategic reward and more a desperate, clumsy attempt to buy affection, which only further highlighted his unsuitability for command. He might have thrown them bags of gold, but he couldn't buy their respect. Historians still argue whether the Praetorian Guard's resentment was primarily due to Elagabalus's religious innovations and effeminate behavior, or if it was more about his political incompetence and the perceived weakness of his rule. Was it his personal eccentricities that truly pushed them over the edge? Or was it the threat he posed to the stability and prestige of the Roman state, which they were sworn to protect? Regardless, the Praetorians were a pragmatic force. They cared about order, stability, and reliable pay. Elagabalus, with his constant upheavals and bizarre priorities, was becoming a liability. You can almost feel the tension building in their barracks, the quiet grumbling that would soon erupt into open rebellion. They were calculating, not laughing, and that spelled doom for the young emperor. The patience of the Praetorian Guard, stretched thin by Elagabalus's antics, finally snapped. His mother, Julia Soemius, and particularly his shrewd grandmother, Julia Mesa, who had initially put him on the throne, also began to see him as a liability. They recognized that his continued rule jeopardized the entire Severan dynasty. So they began to groom a replacement, Elagabalus's cousin, Severus Alexander, a much more conventional and Roman-minded young man. This maneuver is a mainstream historical fact. Elagabalus's own grandmother and mother were instrumental in orchestrating his downfall, favoring his more palatable cousin. Elagabalus, paranoid and increasingly isolated, soon perceived his cousin as a rival. He tried various schemes to undermine Alexander's popularity, even attempting to assassinate him. But by this point, the Praetorian Guard had made their choice. They were tired of the chaos, the scandals, and the bizarre religious innovations. They longed for a return to stability and traditional Roman values, values that Alexander presented as a virtuous and promising youth seemed to embody. The end came swiftly and brutally in March of 222 CE. Elagabalus, along with his mother, sought refuge in the Praetorian camp, likely believing they would be safe among the soldiers they commanded. But the guards had turned. They stormed the camp, intent on putting an end to his reign. A truly quirky tidbit, perhaps apocryphal, but illustrative of the chaos. Some accounts claim Elagabalus tried to hide in a chest or even in a latrine. Such was his desperation. This starkly contrasts with the regal dignity Roman emperors were expected to display even in defeat. He was dragged out, reportedly along with his mother, and both were mercilessly cut down by the Praetorians. Their bodies were then subjected to further indignities. Elagabalus's corpse was dragged through the streets of Rome, a final, humiliating parade. Some sources even claim it was tossed into the Tiber River, a final symbolic rejection by the city he had so thoroughly bewildered. It was a violent, ignominious end for an emperor who had embraced such flamboyant and unconventional ways. Historians still argue whether the Praetorian Guard's decisive action was solely a response to Elagabalus's personal eccentricities and religious fanaticism, or if it was more a strategic decision by Julia Mesa to protect the Severan dynasty by removing an unstable ruler. Was it a popular uprising or a carefully planned coup d'etat orchestrated by his own family? Regardless, for you, a Roman citizen, the sight of his desecrated body would have been a grim reminder of the volatile nature of imperial power and the swift, brutal consequences of failing to maintain the favor of those who wielded the swords. The quiet, repressed humor of the past few years would be replaced by a chilling silence of a different kind, the silence of retribution. After the dramatic and rather undignified end of Elagabalus, the Roman Empire tried its best to simply forget him. You see, when an emperor was deemed particularly egregious, there was a practice called damnatio memoriae, literally the condemnation of memory. This meant that efforts were made to erase all traces of the disgraced emperor from public record. His name might be chiseled off inscriptions, his statues toppled and defaced, and his images removed from coins. This is a mainstream historical fact. Damnatio memoriae was a tool used by the Roman Senate to posthumously punish and disgrace emperors who were deemed unworthy or tyrannical. In Elagabalus's case, while there wasn't a universal, perfectly executed damnatio memoriae, some inscriptions and coins survived, probably because bureaucracy in ancient Rome wasn't always perfectly efficient. The sentiment was certainly there. The Senate quickly passed a decree condemning his memory, and subsequent emperors and historians went to great lengths to paint him as a depraved, effeminate, and utterly unsuitable ruler. His brief reign was largely portrayed as a period of national humiliation and moral decay. Imagine a collective, historical sigh of relief, followed by a frantic attempt to scrub away the embarrassing bits. A truly quirky tidbit related to this attempt to erase him. While many of his statues were indeed destroyed, some might have been recarved into likenesses of his successor Severus Alexander, or other more palatable figures. So, somewhere out there, a stern-faced Roman bust might secretly be a recycled Elagabalus, given a quick nose job and a new wig. It's a subtle act of historical recycling, making the awkward past fit into a more acceptable narrative. Historians still argue whether the extreme negative portrayal of Elagabalus in ancient sources is an accurate reflection of his reign, or if it's heavily biased propaganda designed to justify his overthrow and bolster the image of his successor. Was he truly as mad and depraved as history paints him? Or was he simply too unconventional and foreign for the Roman establishment to tolerate, leading them to exaggerate his flaws? The ancient writers, many of whom were traditional Romans, clearly harbored a deep distaste for his Eastern religious practices and perceived effeminacy, which undoubtedly colored their accounts. Regardless, for you, a Roman citizen living through the aftermath, the official narrative would be clear. Elagabalus was a mistake, a dark chapter, and Rome was now happily moving on to a brighter, more traditional future. You'd find yourself avoiding any mention of his name, lest you seem to sympathize with the recently erased. With Elagabalus gone, Rome breathed a collective sigh of relief, and the new emperor, his cousin Severus Alexander, was everything Elagabalus wasn't: traditional, serious, and deeply respectful of Roman customs. You'd feel a return to normalcy, a slow easing of the stifling atmosphere that had permeated the city for the past 4 years. The Forum, once hushed by the threat of imperial disapproval, would gradually begin to echo with the familiar sounds of lively debate, commerce, and yes, the occasional burst of genuine laughter. The strange religious practices associated with Elagabal faded away. The black stone of Elagabal was removed from its prominent position on the Palatine Hill and reportedly sent back to Emesa, its rightful home. The sacred Roman relics that Elagabalus had so scandalously moved were returned to their original shrines. It was a conscious effort to restore the old order, to clean up the mess left by the eccentric young emperor. This is a mainstream historical fact. Severus Alexander reversed many of Elagabalus's controversial religious policies and worked to restore traditional Roman values and institutions. The peculiar punishments, the odd banquets, and the constant fear of offending an unpredictable ruler all receded into memory, becoming cautionary tales whispered in hushed tones rather than daily anxieties. A truly quirky tidbit that demonstrates the return to normalcy. The extravagant, sometimes chaotic, games Elagabalus favored were replaced with more conventional Roman spectacles. No more surprise serpents or ostrich-drawn chariots, just good, honest gladiatorial combat and chariot races, perhaps with a more predictable sprinkling of gold coins, not pearls. Historians still argue whether the Roman people truly welcomed this return to tradition, or if a part of them, however small, secretly missed the bizarre spectacle and unpredictable entertainment that Elagabalus's reign had provided. Was the stability offered by Alexander a truly desired outcome, or just a necessary evil after 4 years of chaos? Perhaps for some, the sheer weirdness of Elagabalus had been in its own way, exhilarating. Regardless, for you, the everyday Roman, the immediate aftermath of Elagabalus's downfall would have brought a palpable sense of relief. The air itself would feel lighter, and the freedom to express genuine joy, to laugh openly without fear, would be a small but significant victory, a quiet reclamation of your own human spirit. You'd find yourself smiling a little more freely, breathing a little deeper, as Rome slowly, deliberately recovered its smile.